The American policy process entrusts government career administrators with an extraordinary responsibility for the implementation of public policy. Political accountability normally is taken to mean that administrative agencies are subject to the supervising authority of elected officials. Typically, this political accountability includes dual responsibility to the chief executive, who provides administrative oversight, and to the legislative branch, which creates the legal and budget authority for the agency. Serving two political authorities at the same time can obviously pose policy implementation problems for administrators. These problems will not arise as long as the legislative body has internal agreement on what needs to be done, provides clear policy guidelines, and is in agreement with the executive branch on agency direction. Under these conditions, however, there is extensive administrative discretion that needs to be kept accountable. There are some less favorable circumstances that create challenges for administrators in policy implementation processes, which include the following. The executive and legislative bodies are polarized along party lines. The legislative body has a hidden agenda or is politically divided. The legislative body is unclear about what the problems and solutions are, or the legislative body is oblivious to the operational barriers to implementing its legislative intent. To the extent that these conditions prevail, administrators are left with the challenge of figuring out what is to be done and to do so in ways that meets the tests of political accountability to both its executive and legislative superiors. The chief executive officer in public agencies has enormous leverage over those administrative agencies. Let's take a look. The chief executive officer has a wide variety of mechanisms available to exert centralized control and accountability, including shared budget authority, power over personnel decisions, management directives and monitoring systems, influence over rulemaking and access to the media, and a direct pipeline to the members of the legislative body and the larger voting public. Legislative accountability runs close to the heart of the American system of democratic governance. In its most extreme form, legislative accountability can mean that it's irresponsible for administrators to use their technical expertise unless and until there is a direct command to do so by elected representatives. The legislative-centered model of administrative accountability, like its executive-centered counterpart, is very difficult to carry out in practice. The realities of the legislative process make it nearly impossible to provide administrators with discretion-proof policy implementation strategies. The burden of maintaining bureaucratic accountability is a multipronged undertaking that includes reliance on organizational and legal processes, in addition to political accountability to the two major branches of governance. The most frequently used mechanism of administrative accountability is reliance on formal organizational structures and processes. In fact, much of the reinvention of government aimed to achieve greater personal accountability through flattening organizations and increasing the discretionary authority at the lowest levels of the administrative hierarchy. There is significant importance in creating personnel and organizational accountability through appropriate structuring of administrative processes and systems. These, in addition to organizational design and operations, play a central role in achieving administrative accountability in the policy implementation process. Let's discuss some of the major organizational controls that are relied upon to achieve this result. One way of creating administrative accountability in the implementation process is to rely on policy coordination and control. Chief executive officers can do this by establishing a centralized policy advisory committee, which may consist of department directors or personal policy advisors. The most common mechanism of organizational control is exercised through the budget process. The chief executive officer for most jurisdictions in the United States has the responsibility to organize and present an integrated budget request to the legislative body for deliberation and approval. This responsibility enables the chief executive officer to maintain accountability of the administrative agencies by controlling the initial request for their annual operating budgets. But budgetary control is not limited to the chief executive. Since no public agency can spend any money without legislative approval of funds, the legislative body plays an important role in using the budget to maintain organizational accountability during the policy implementation. Administrative accountability cannot be maintained without control over the individuals who carry out the work of organizations. The continuity and predictability that the civil service and merit systems, as well as public unions, play in the policy implementation process is important. This is an important part of what accountability means. Finally, most jurisdictions rely on a centralized organizational structure to maintain accountability in the policy implementation process. Despite the best organizational and political efforts to maintain accountability over administrators during the policy implementation process, we have not eliminated the need for the exercise of extensive administrative discretion. The growing recognition of this necessity has shifted attention away from relying on mechanisms of external political and organizational accountability to those that depend on the bureaucracy to police itself based on a set of broad legal rules established by the legislature. In practice, this means that government and its political and administrative agents must be able to find a law, rule, or constitutional provision to justify their actions. Now, let's focus on administrative-centered legal controls, especially administrative rulemaking and adjudication. The administrative procedures in place at the federal and state levels of government share the following characteristics. They require that all agencies regularize their reporting of proposed rules, usually in a formal publication. The procedures require opportunities for comment by potential parties affected by the proposed rule, and the guidelines provide for the appeal of adverse decisions by administrators against individuals. There are two major questions involving the rulemaking process, the answers to which dramatically shape the nature of accountability achieved by a jurisdiction's administrative procedures. First, what is the required burden of proof on administrators before they can adopt a rule? Second, and what is a rule, as opposed to an internal set of managerial guidelines, procedures, or policy clarifications? Accountability is a function of the openness of the rulemaking process and access by citizens to it. Additionally, accountability dictates whether agencies have to listen to the testimony and evidence that is presented. Burden of proof has to do with the amount and kind of information that's needed to make decisions based on less than complete information. The formal definition of a rule under the Administrative Procedures Act, like burden of proof, is also critically important in determining the amount and the extent of administrative accountability that is achieved through the administrative rulemaking process. The administrative rulemaking process provides an opportunity to serve a multitude of potentially conflicting needs of the American democratic system of governance. First, it can be used to obtain useful information that will broaden and deepen an understanding of a given problem and the appropriate range of solutions. Second, it can be used to legitimate a process of governance by providing opportunities for participation. Third and finally, it can be used to provide a check against the arbitrary and capricious exercise of government authority. In addition to their rulemaking authority, administrative agencies frequently perform the same function as courts in their adjudicated role in deciding individual cases. It is deciding the outcome of an individual case by applying and interpreting existing rules rather than developing new rules for future general application. Since justice for the individual is the focus of an administrative adjudication, the main concern is to ensure the appropriateness and correctness of the decision. Ethics is the code of moral principles and values that govern the behaviors of a person or group with respect to what is right or wrong. In addition to the statutory constraints placed on administrators to ensure accountability, increasing emphasis has been placed on the internal standards of accountability that arise from viewing public administration as a profession. One way of understanding what this means in practice is to read the Code of Ethics for the American Society of Public Administration. The professional code sets forth at least half a dozen standards by which we can judge administrative accountability and responsibility. A major problem with these kinds of professional codes, however, is they tend to embrace clear technical and legalistic standards, or they're so broad as to be legally unenforceable. While the ASPA code has been criticized for its unenforceability and generality, there is a core consensus that it does a good job of memorializing the values at the core of public service. The code thus shifts our focus away from debate over what should be on our list of public service values to a debate over the kind of framework that is needed to balance and reconcile conflicts among those values.